Portland, Oregon is a city which has many unique characteristics to it. One of these lesser known aspects of the city's reputation includes a rare type of Canadian road switchers which pulls passenger and freight with other rare diesel switchers on a former interurban route for a 5-mile long short line which passes 3 car tracks and a railroad museum. The main locomotive on this route was also one of the last of its kind in service on Canadian National, one of a few locomotives in the Canadian exclusive GMD1 class to be exported to the US, and was modified in order to meet the conditions of the Oregon shortline. Many of these unusual traits can only make up the unique story of Oregon Pacific number 1413. Before we start this episode, I'd like to ask you a question. What comes to mind when hearing the word Canada? If you thought grain, you'd be correct. Canada is known for its vast grain fields in the remote regions of the country, most of which is transported to the rest of the world via rail, specifically with sidings and branch lines to grain plants in the prairies. Thousands of miles of tracks were built to reach the vast grain fields of the nation, but they were used less as often by the 1950s. Despite this, locomotives continued to get larger and heavier to pull more cars, and many of these remote, lightly used branch lines implemented weight limits of 160,000 pounds on driver wheels. Rather than replace over 3,000 miles of track, Canadian National, one of the 2 major railroads in Canada, decided to design a locomotive that could effectively replace the steam locomotive for good, and operate on a light track while still pulling heavy loads of grain cars. The solution was the GMD-1, with the GMD standing for General Motors Division, the Canadian division of VMD, and the -1 for being the first model entirely designed and built by GMD. It was essentially a stretched out EMD SW1200 with A1A trucks containing a non-powered idler axle to distribute the weight, thus having a driver weight just under the weight limit with 159,000 pounds. A total of 101 GMD-1s were built between 1958 and 1960, with all but 5 of these Canadian originals being sold to Canadian National, who numbered the A-truck variants 1000 to 1077, with number 1045, the locomotive we focused on, being built in February 1959. They were also classified as the Canadian National Class GR12W, with the G standing for General Motors, R standing for Road Switcher, 12 standing for 1200 horsepower, and the W standing for the order number. These locomotives could be found on remote grain branches of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in either the classic green and yellow, or more commonly, the red, black, and white of CN's noodle logo, or in the case of 1045, a red CN logo for unknown reasons, though this was likely the result of the white paint wearing off. Yet in 1977, the Canadian government enacted laws that allowed railroads to abandon the prairie branch lines which were not considered economically feasible, thus limiting the uses of the GMD-1 on the shrinking amount of rural branch lines. However, not all was lost for these road switchers, as CN decided to refurbish them for yard and transfer duties starting in 1983, with major differences including conversion to B-B trucks from retired GP9s, fuel tanks twice the size of the original, new EMD control panels, and installation of EMD 12645 prime movers, as they were then reclassified as the class GR412A, G standing for General Motors, R standing for Road Switcher, 4 standing for the 4-axle trucks, 12 standing for the 1200 horsepower, and A standing for the rebuilt batch number. 1045 received these upgrades to bring it up to SW1500 specifications at the Point St. Charles shops in Montreal in 1989, and was renumbered to 1413 as it joined a total of 24 rebuilt GMD-1s in road switching service, although this duty wouldn't last long as they were replaced by GP38s and were assigned to yard duties in the Winnipeg, Manitoba region, thus keeping their Central Canada heritage. By the early 2000s, many of the now 40-year-old GMD-1s were either sold to smaller railroads in Canada and Cuba, or were sold for preservation, while the parent railroad decided to keep a good amount of their remaining GMD-1s, including 1413, for continued work in yards, as 1413 was refurbished as recent as 2005. Even after their retirement from Canadian National, the GMD-1s still found much use on the short lines they were sold to, as needed reliable power for short distances. One of the most recent examples of this includes the Oregon Pacific Railroad, which purchased a locomotive from Western Rail in exchange for 2 SW8s, numbers 602 and 803. The locomotive was repainted into a blank version of the short line's red and white stripe in August 2010, and was delivered a few days later via BNSF from Pasco to Portland, Oregon. This would be the railroad's second Canadian locomotive, with the first being OPR 1202, formerly CP Rail 7403, as well as its newest and strongest as a GMD-1 built in 1959. Once the locomotive arrived on the Oregon Pacific, it went through numerous modifications. Specifically, the white snow cowling over the radiator grille was removed and replaced with a conventional screen-type grille. The front train line was rerouted so the air can be cut from the engine side, switcher style. The snowplows were removed and replaced with straight steel pilots, and the ladder style steps were replaced with more conventional stair steps for conductor safety. 1413 was also slightly repainted with maintenance stripes on the short end rather than a plain white stripe, as well as black exhaust stacks in the railroad's motto, thus being the first locomotive on the roster to have the motto. It was also named after and dedicated to Eileen Williams Samuels, the mother of Richard Samuel, the owner of the OPR, who passed away earlier that year. After all of these modifications, 1413 started testing on the East Portland Division, but rolling action was discovered on the locomotive, which delayed its first run in service by 2 years in order to install custom-made shocks as other projects took priority. Although it did make an appearance with Southern Pacific 4449 at Portland Union Station for National Train Day on May 7, 2011. Finally, in July of 2012, 1413 entered revenue service on the East Portland Division, one of 2 divisions of the short line consisting of 5 miles on the ex-Portland Traction Company from the East Portland Yard to Milwaukee Industrial Park, sharing the line with 3 other rare and older switchers: OPR 5100, a Southern Pacific GE 70-tonner still in its original SP paint, OPR 802, an XSP SW8 originally numbered 1127 in Northern Pacific livery, and Portland Traction 100, which still runs on the same route for all of its life. Other than transporting freight cars from Union Pacific, the locomotive also pulls weekly passenger excursions along the route with an open-air car, an open-air caboose, and a Burlington Northern caboose. Since the Oregon Rail Heritage Center is right next to the Oregon Pacific's northernmost terminus at the East Portland Yard and is accessible via OPR trackage, tourists are able to visit both the OPR and the engine shed with Oregon Railroad Navigation 197, SPNS 700, and the famous Southern Pacific 4449. Today, the locomotive can be found pulling freight cars and custom-made passenger cars along the 5-mile route, representing the uniqueness of Portland and an important part of the ongoing story of the GMD-1. Thank you all for watching this episode of Remarkable Engines. This rare Canadian locomotive was able to last through the test of time on Canadian National and then find a new home with other unique diesels in a unique American city. Although the GMD-1 is still in service for Canadian National, there are only a handful of them left as more are being retired each year. Therefore, it is increasingly rare to see a GMD-1 in service on any railroad, especially one that isn't in its home country, as they have been performing a wide variety of assignments for railroads in Canada and beyond for over 60 years. Thank you again for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and stay tuned next time when I go over LARR 404. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Have a good day.